The auction hall on East 72nd Street smelled of aged mahogany and money. 300 seats had been arranged in curved rows across the polished herringbone floor, each one occupied by someone whose net worth exceeded the GDP of a small island nation. Crystal sconces threw warm light across the walls where paintings worth more than apartment buildings hung in gilded frames. And at the center of the low stage, under a single overhead spot, sat the Whitfield Concert Grand. It was a 1926 custom Steinway, finished in a lacquer so deep and black that the stage lights seemed to sink into it and never return. The lid had been raised to its full height, exposing the harp and strings like the open chest of a sleeping giant. It had not been played in 12 years, not since the morning Arthur Whitfield, the founder of Whitfield and Pace Auction House, had collapsed on this very stage during a private recital and never stood again. Sloane Whitfield stood beside the piano in a floor-length emerald gown. Her dark hair swept into a low knot at the base of her neck. She was 34 years old. She had been running the auction house for 18 months, and in that time she had watched the company her grandfather built slide quietly toward irrelevance, while a man named Douglas Pemberton, the 61-year-old vice chairman of the board, assembled enough votes behind closed doors to force a merger she had not agreed to. Tonight was supposed to end the argument. Sloane had secured a commitment from Miriam Kessler, the 73-year-old philanthropist whose foundation controlled access to the largest private art trust in North America. Miriam had agreed to a 10-year exclusive consignment deal worth an estimated $120 million. But she had made one condition perfectly clear over dinner 6 months earlier. She wanted to hear the Whitfield Grand play. Not a recording. Not a digital reproduction. She wanted to sit in that hall and hear the instrument Arthur Whitfield had once played for her late husband on the night of their engagement 51 years ago. She wanted proof that the house still honored what it sold. Sloane lifted the microphone. Her voice carried the trained composure of a woman who had learned to smile through hostile shareholder meetings before she turned 30. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we bring back a voice that has been silent for over a decade. She gave the nod. Julian Cross, the 38-year-old head of Whitfield's instrument division and a Juilliard-trained pianist, settled onto the bench with the quiet confidence of a man who had performed in concert halls across Europe. He adjusted his cuffs. He placed his fingers on the keys. The first chord came out wrong. Not silent. Worse. It came out fractured. A cluster of notes that should have rung together in a clean C major triad, instead producing a thin, sour, wavering sound that spread across the auction hall like a crack through glass. Julian frowned. He tried again, slower this time, pressing individual keys. Some responded. Others produced a dull, choked thud, as though the hammers were striking felt instead of string. 3 keys in the upper register gave no sound at all. A murmur moved through the audience the way wind moves through tall grass. Miriam Kessler, seated in the second row in a charcoal wool suit, tilted her head slightly. Her expression did not change, but Sloane, who had studied Miriam's face across 4 separate dinners, recognized the small tightening at the corner of her mouth. It was the look she gave when she was preparing to leave a room quietly and never return. Douglas Pemberton, seated 3 rows behind Miriam, allowed his right hand to relax against the armrest. He did not smile. He did not need to. The woman beside him, his attorney, was already pulling a document folder from her briefcase. Near the side entrance, half hidden behind a black curtain that separated the main hall from the loading corridor, a tall man in a gray canvas jacket stood with his hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl. Calvin Briggs was 41 years old. He had driven down from Rhinebeck that morning in a truck with a cracked windshield to help move 3 upright pianos from the loading dock to the second-floor gallery. The job paid $260. It was not enough to cover the gas and the babysitter. But there had been no babysitter. He had brought his daughter instead. Rosie Briggs was 7. She had her mother's wide-set brown eyes and her father's habit of standing very still when she was thinking. In her left hand, she held a small brass music box, no bigger than a deck of cards, with a tiny hand crank on its side. Her mother had given it to her 3 days before a December ice storm turned a 2-lane highway outside Kingston into something no amount of skill or prayer could navigate. That was 2.5 years ago. Calvin still kept Beth's reading glasses in the glove compartment. He had not been able to move them. Rosie never asked why they were there. She simply knew that some things stay where they are placed, because moving them would mean admitting the person who put them there is not coming back. Calvin had not intended to be standing within earshot of the stage. His shift had ended 40 minutes ago, but Rosie had seen the grand piano through the curtain gap while he was signing out, and she had pulled his hand with both of hers the way she always did when something mattered enough to risk being told no. "Daddy, it's like the one in Mommy's picture." Beth had kept a photograph on the piano lid at home, a snapshot of her grandmother seated at a concert grand in the dress with a Peter Pan collar, taken sometime in the 1950s. Rosie had memorized every detail of that photograph the way some children memorize maps of imaginary countries. So Calvin had stayed. He had crouched beside the curtain with Rosie on his knee and watched the room fill with people whose shoes cost more than his truck payment, and when the first broken chord rang out, he felt something tighten behind his sternum. Not pity, recognition. He had tuned and restored pianos since he was 15. His father, a church organist in a small town outside Albany, had taught him to listen for the difference between a string that was out of tune and a mechanism that was out of alignment. By 20, Calvin could diagnose a stuck damper by the way the sustain decayed. By 25, restoration shops in Vermont and Connecticut were referring clients to him. He had no conservatory training. He had something that could not be taught in a conservatory. He had the patience to sit with a broken instrument until it told him what was wrong. After Beth died, the travel stopped. The referrals from out of state, the week-long restoration jobs at estates in the Berkshires, all of it required leaving Rosie with someone, and there was no one left to leave her with. Beth's parents were gone. Calvin's father had passed 2 years before Beth, so Calvin took the work that let him stay close. He tuned uprights at churches and elementary schools. He repaired sustain pedals for music teachers who paid him in checks that sometimes cleared and sometimes did not. He packed Rosie's lunch every morning, picked her up every afternoon, and read to her every night until her breathing changed and her hand went slack around the music box she kept on her pillow. On the stage, Julian Cross was now speaking to a technician in a low, urgent voice. The technician shook his head. Julian tried a passage in the middle register. The notes came out muddy, layered with a faint buzzing that no amount of surface adjustment would fix. Something deeper was wrong. Something structural. Calvin heard it from 30 feet away through a curtain. He spoke under his breath, more to himself than to Rosie. "That's not the strings. Something's binding the action from underneath." His voice did not carry far, but it carried far enough. Sloane Whitfield had stepped off the stage and was standing less than 10 feet from the curtain, her back to him, speaking into her phone in a voice tight with controlled panic. She heard the sentence. She turned. She saw a man in a canvas work jacket with sawdust still visible on one shoulder. She saw a small girl holding a brass music box. She saw scuffed boots on a herringbone floor that had been polished that morning by a crew who would not have let those boots pass the front door. In a calmer moment, Sloane might have asked what he meant. She might have recognized the certainty in his voice for what it was. But she was not calm. She was standing in a hall full of people watching her fail, with Miriam Kessler's patience dissolving by the second and Douglas Pemberton's attorney pulling out paperwork. And the sound of her grandfather's piano breaking apart under Julian's hands was breaking something apart inside her that she did not have time to name. She did what cornered people do. She made the stranger into a joke. "You think you can fix a 1926 Steinway concert grand?" She said it with a smile that was designed for the two donors standing near enough to hear. "Go ahead. Fix it, and I'll let you headline Carnegie Hall." The laughter was immediate. It came from the donors first, then from a young gallery assistant near the curtain who laughed because his boss had laughed, and then from a security guard named Trent McGuire, a 44-year-old former bouncer who had been stationed at the side entrance specifically to keep the loading crew away from the guests. Trent stepped forward. He was built like a refrigerator, and had the professionally blank expression of a man who had spent 20 years removing people from places they were not supposed to be. "Your shift's done," Trent said, looking at Calvin the way one looks at a stain on a white tablecloth. Then he looked at Rosie. "This isn't a place for kids." Rosie pressed closer to her father's leg. She had done nothing wrong. She had only wanted to see a piano that looked like the one in her mother's photograph. But in the arithmetic of that room, she was a subtraction. She and her father were the kind of people this building was built to display things to, not to include. Calvin placed his hand on the top of Rosie's head. He did not look at Trent. He spoke only to her. "It's okay, sweetheart. We can go." He had been through rooms like this before. Every man who works in other people's houses long enough learns to distinguish between the ones who see him and the ones who see through him. He had learned to leave without losing anything important. But Rosie had not learned that yet, and he was not going to teach her tonight. He took her hand and turned toward the loading corridor. The two donors near the curtain stepped aside, not out of courtesy but out of the mild discomfort that polite people feel when someone is being escorted away. Sloane watched them go, and somewhere beneath the emergency in her chest, beneath the calculations about Miriam and Douglas and the future of the company, a small, cold point of doubt lodged itself between her ribs. She saw the child's face. She saw the way the man's hand covered the girl's entire fist and held it gently, as though it were something that might break. But because Sloane Woodfield had spent 18 months learning to override doubt with decisiveness, she turned back to the stage and pretended she had not seen anything at all. Calvin and Rosie were 6 steps into the loading corridor when Rosie stopped walking. She did not pull away. She simply planted her feet the way she did when she did not want to leave the library at closing time. Her grip on the music box tightened until the little brass crank pressed a white line into her palm. "Daddy." Her voice was very small, the way it got when she was about to say something she was afraid might be too big for the room. "Mommy said you could hear what's wrong with any piano in the whole world." Calvin closed his eyes. Beth had said that. She had said it on a Sunday afternoon in October while he was lying on his back under the soundboard of a Bussendorfer that 2 other technicians had written off. She had been standing in the doorway of his workshop holding Rosie, who was 4 at the time, and she had said it the way she said everything, like it was a fact she had looked up and confirmed. He had not heard those words spoken out loud since the accident. He had heard them inside his own head 1,000 times, on nights when the checking account was thin and the truck needed a part he could not afford, and the future looked like nothing but the next church tuning and the next packed lunch. But hearing them now from his daughter's mouth, in this hallway, with the sound of that broken Steinway still ringing faintly through the wall, was something else entirely. If he walked out now, he was not wrong. Any reasonable person would leave. But Rosie would learn something tonight. She would learn that when people laugh at your father, the correct response is to leave quietly, even when he knows the answer and they do not. She would carry that lesson into every classroom and every job interview for the rest of her life. He could not hand his daughter that inheritance. Calvin turned around. The corridor was dim and smelled of packing foam and old wood. Through the gap in the curtain, the auction hall glowed like the inside of a lantern. He could see Sloane near the stage, arms crossed, jaw set. He could see Julian standing helplessly beside the open piano. He could see Miriam Kessler reaching for her coat. He walked back through the curtain with Rosie's hand in his. The room had not recovered from its own nervous laughter. A few faces near the front still wore the pinched smiles of people who had enjoyed someone else's embarrassment. Sloane saw him approaching and her expression shifted through several things at once: surprise, irritation, and something she could not quite name. Calvin stopped 3 feet from the stage. He did not raise his voice. But the hall had gone quiet enough that the words carried to the last row. "I'll take a look. Not for Carnegie Hall. Not for whatever that was supposed to be. I'm doing it because my daughter believes I can, and I don't intend to prove her wrong tonight." The laughter that had been hovering at the edges of the room died. Sloane stared at him. No one had ever responded to her like that. The man in front of her was not performing. He was not negotiating. He was not even particularly aware of the 300 people watching him. He was a father standing inside the gaze of his own child, and it made every other gaze in the room feel like scenery. 2 minutes, Sloane said. Her voice was quieter than before. "You have 2 minutes." Calvin stepped onto the stage. He did not open the fallboard. He did not ask for tools. He did not look at the technician's notes or Julian's hands. Instead, he placed both palms flat on the closed lid of the piano and bent his head slightly, the way a man leans close to listen to a sleeping child breathe. Julian gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "What is he doing?" Agnes Fairchild did not laugh. Agnes was 63 years old. She had been the chief conservator at Whitfield and Pace for 31 years, the only remaining staff member who had worked directly under Arthur Whitfield in the years before his death. She had watched this stranger place his hands on the instrument, and she had recognized the posture immediately. It was the posture of someone who had listened to 10,000 pianos. It was not theater. It was diagnosis. "Play one note," Calvin said to Julian without looking up. "Middle C. Hold the key down. Don't release." Julian looked at Sloane. Sloane nodded once. Julian pressed the key. A note emerged, but it was thin and buzzing, decaying far too quickly, with a metallic rattle underneath that should not have been there. Calvin opened his eyes. Someone replaced the hammers in the mid-range, but they left the original damper felts in place. The room held its breath. Agnes Fairchild took a step closer to the stage. "Those felts were Arthur's," Agnes said carefully. "Original to the instrument. We kept them for authenticity when the hammers were replaced last year." Calvin nodded slowly. "That's part of the problem. The new hammers are striking with a different weight than the old dampers expect. The timing is off by fractions of a second. That's your buzzing, but that's not the main issue." Sloane frowned. "Then what is?" For the first time, Calvin looked directly at her. Not as hired labor. Not as a man who had been laughed at. As a man who had been laughed at. As a man who understood exactly what he was touching. "This piano has a mechanical lock built into it, somewhere inside the action. Your grandfather put it there. It's preventing the sustain mechanism from fully engaging, which is why the notes die too fast and the upper register won't speak at all. The piano isn't broken. It's refusing to play." Agnes drew a sharp breath. She pressed her hand to her mouth. A memory she had not visited in more than a decade surfaced with sudden, startling clarity. Arthur Whitfield, in his final years, had grown deeply protective of this instrument. He had spoken about it the way some men speak about a house they built with their own hands. He had told Agnes once, on a winter afternoon when the hall was empty and the light was gray, that a piano worth keeping ought to have a voice of its own, and if you were going to leave it behind, you should make sure that only someone who truly listened could wake it up. Agnes had thought it was poetry. The rambling sentimentality of an old man who knew he was running out of afternoons. Sloane heard Agnes's breath catch. She did not understand why until her own memory offered something up without permission. She had been 9 years old, sitting on the piano bench beside her grandfather, and he had placed her hand on the soundboard and told her to feel the vibration. "A piano that matters," he had said, "will only sing for someone who knows how to ask." She had thought he was telling a bedtime story. Calvin knelt beside the piano and ran his fingers slowly along the underside of the keybed, tracing the grain of the wood the way a blind man reads a page. He was not looking for something specific. He was listening with his hands for an inconsistency, a seam that did not match, a surface that did not belong. Douglas Pemberton had risen from his seat and was moving toward the stage with the controlled urgency of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine the future of a company. Sloane. His voice was measured. Quiet enough that only the front rows heard. This instrument is valued at $3.4 million. You are allowing an unvetted laborer to put his hands inside it. Whatever damage occurs becomes your personal liability. He turned smoothly toward Miriam Kessler. Mrs. Kessler, I apologize for this disruption. We will, of course, continue our conversation in a more appropriate setting. It was an elegant move. It would end the evening, the demonstration, and Sloane's career at the auction house in a single clean stroke. Sloane looked at Miriam. The older woman said nothing, but her eyes had moved from the piano to Calvin, and in them was something that Sloane had never seen in any of their previous meetings. It was curiosity. Calvin had already begun to withdraw his hand from the instrument. He stood up slowly and looked at Sloane. There was no anger in his face. There was only a patience that seemed older than the room. You have every right to stop me, he said. But if you stop now, this piano stays quiet. Not because it can't play, because nobody's been willing to listen to it long enough to find what your grandfather left behind. Sloane heard her grandfather's voice again, distant and warm, echoing across 25 years. You have to listen. That's all. Just listen. She looked down from the stage. Rosie was standing at the foot of the steps, clutching her music box in both hands, her face tilted up toward her father with the kind of absolute, uncomplicated faith that had once lived in Sloane's own chest, a long time ago, in a room that smelled of lemon oil and piano wire. This is not about an instrument, Sloane thought, with a clarity that frightened her. This is about a child who needs the world to see her father the way she does. Let him finish. Douglas turned sharply. Sloane, let him finish, Douglas. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. It carried the weight of a woman who had just decided to stop being afraid of the man who had been trying to take her grandfather's name away from her for 2 years. I take full responsibility. Calvin met her eyes for a moment. Then he knelt again beside the instrument. His fingers moved along the underside of the keybed, past the familiar geometry of the action rails, past the capstan screws and the repetition levers, into a space where the wood grain shifted subtly, where the varnish was a shade darker than it should have been, where decades ago someone had fitted a panel so precisely into the body of the piano that it had become invisible. His fingertips found a small brass lever no longer than a house key, recessed into a dovetail joint and painted to match the surrounding wood so closely that even under direct light it cast no shadow. There, he said softly. He explained in a voice barely above a whisper. Arthur Whitfield had built a mechanical interlock into the piano's action, a small brass arm that, when engaged, restricted the travel of the damper rail by a few millimeters, just enough to prevent the dampers from lifting fully off the strings. The sustain pedal would still depress, the keys would still move, but the full voice of the instrument, the resonance, the overtones, the deep singing sustain that made a concert grand sound like a living thing, would remain locked away. The restoration team have replaced enough components around the lock that the brass arm had shifted into a position where it partially engaged even when it should have been disengaged. Every diagnostic they ran reported problems with the dampers, the hammers, the strings, but the piano was functioning exactly as Arthur Whitfield had designed it to function. It was simply refusing to sing for people who had not found its secret. Sloane had come down from her position near the microphone and was standing beside the open piano. She was no longer carrying herself like a chief executive defending a quarterly projection. She was standing the way a granddaughter stands when she is suddenly close to something her grandfather's hands once touched. "How did you know he would do something like this?" she asked quietly. Calvin did not look up. Because men who love an instrument this much don't just maintain it. They protect it. They hide the best part of it where only someone who's really paying attention will ever find it. For a long moment, Sloane could not speak. It was true of the piano. It was true of her grandfather. And it was perhaps true of the man kneeling in front of her. The man she had turned into a punchline less than 10 minutes ago. Calvin looked up at her. "If this works," he said, You should be the one to play the first note. Not him. He glanced at Julian. Not me. You. The room shifted. Your grandfather built this. If it's going to speak again, the first person to hear it from that bench should be his family. Sloane Whitfield sat down at the Steinway. The bench was cool beneath her. The smell that rose from the open cabinet was the smell of her childhood, of her grandfather's study, of Saturday mornings when the hall was empty and the light came through the high windows and Arthur Whitfield would let her sit on his lap while he played Debussy with the soft pedal down so as not to wake the cat. Her composure, the armor she had built across 18 months of board meetings and hostile votes and lonely dinners in a company apartment, fell away as quietly as a coat slipping from a chair. Under the lights, she was no longer the chief executive of Whitfield and Pace. She was a granddaughter sitting at a piano her grandfather had loved, hoping it would still know her. Calvin stood at the side of the instrument. He guided her with the calm, even voice of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Press the sustain pedal all the way down. Hold it there. She pressed. Now reach under the key bed. Do you feel the brass lever? It's small, about the size of your little finger. Her hand, not entirely steady, found the cool metal tab. Pull it gently toward you. This piano doesn't respond to force. It never did. She drew the lever. There was a soft click, a tiny mechanical release, no louder than a locket opening. Somewhere inside the body of the instrument, a brass arm withdrew from the damper rail, and the full weight of the damper mechanism settled into its proper resting position for the first time in over a decade. Calvin listened. The room listened. Miriam Kessler, who had been reaching for her coat 5 minutes ago, was now sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. Douglas Pemberton stood near the aisle with his attorney. His face had the color of a man watching a building he had spent 2 years constructing begin to lean. Trent Maguire, who had told Calvin his shift was done and the hall was no place for a child, was staring at the floor. He had discovered, without quite understanding why, that he was ashamed. Rosie stood beside Agnes Fairchild at the foot of the stage, her face lifted in absolute attention. The brass music box pressed against her chest. Now play, Calvin said. Anything. Whatever comes. Sloane placed her fingers on the keys. She had not played seriously since college. She did not attempt Chopin or Liszt or anything that would have tested her. She played the simplest thing she knew. She played the opening bars of Clair de Lune, the piece her grandfather had played for her on Saturday mornings when she was a girl. The piece that had once made her believe that a piano could hold moonlight inside its strings. The first note rose from the instrument like a breath released after years of holding. It filled the auction hall the way light fills a room when a curtain is drawn back from a window that has been shuttered for a long time. The overtone spread upward through the high ceiling and hung there, shimmering, layered, alive. The Whitfield Concert Grand, after 12 years of silence, was singing. The second note followed. The third. Each one richer than the last, as though the piano were remembering its own voice. The bass strings resonated with a depth that vibrated in the floorboards beneath the audience's feet. The treble sang with a clarity that made the crystal sconces hum in sympathy. Sloane's hands, resting on the keys, began to tremble. Her eyes, fixed on the fallboard, filled slowly. She did not let the tears fall. She did not have to. The room saw them, and the room understood that the woman at the piano was not performing. She was listening to her grandfather's voice coming back to her across a decade of silence. She played for perhaps 90 seconds. Then she lifted her hands from the keys and let the final chord sustain until it faded into a silence so complete that the room seemed to hold its shape around the space where the sound had been. No one applauded, not because they were unmoved, because they had forgotten, briefly, that applause was something people did. Then it began. A single pair of hands near the back row. Then another, then a wave that moved forward through the hall until even the board members who had been quietly allied with Douglas Pemberton were clapping out of reflex and something they could not quite name. Miriam Kessler turned to the young assistant beside her and spoke without expression. "Call Richard. Tell him to prepare the consignment agreement. We are proceeding." Douglas Pemberton's face went very still. The 2-year campaign he had built, the quiet meetings, the coalition of votes, the merger documents his attorney was still holding in a leather folder. All of it had come apart in the space of 90 seconds of Debussy, undone by a man in a canvas jacket he had described in a private email 3 weeks earlier as a day laborer from upstate. Agnes Fairchild did not clap. She stood with her arms at her sides and looked at Calvin Briggs, and her expression carried a respect that she had not given another human being since Arthur Whitfield had closed the fallboard for the last time. But the moment that mattered most did not belong to the applause. It belonged to a 7-year-old girl in a blue fleece jacket who had been standing at the foot of the stage with her music box clutched against her chest and who now ran up the steps in 3 quick strides and threw herself into her father's arms. "I knew it, Daddy." Her voice cracked on the second word, broken open by the tears she had been holding behind her eyes since the security guard told them to leave. "I knew you could." Calvin knelt and gathered her in. He did not look at the cameras first. He did not look at Sloane first. He did not look at Miriam Kessler, whose money would change the shape of his year, first. He looked at his daughter. He pressed his forehead against her small forehead and breathed once, slowly, the way a man breathes when something inside him that has been carrying too much weight for too long is finally, for one moment, allowed to set it down. Sloane rose from the bench. She crossed the stage until she stood directly in front of Calvin and Rosie. The clip-on microphone on the neckline of her gown was still live. 300 people would hear what came next, and she did not turn it off. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not the company. Me. I looked at what you were wearing before I looked at what you knew. I am sorry." The hall, which had barely recovered its breath, went quiet a second time. It was a different quiet. Not the quiet of suspense. The quiet that follows an honest sentence. Calvin stood with Rosie still in his arms. He did not gloat. He did not deliver a speech. He nodded once. "Thank you, Ms. Whitfield." That was all. Within 20 minutes the gala had reversed itself entirely. Miriam Kessler's legal team was in a side room redrafting the consignment terms with provisions more favorable than Sloane had dared to propose. Douglas Pemberton left through a service exit without speaking to anyone. He would resign from the board within 2 weeks. Julian Cross found Calvin near the loading corridor and shook his hand without a word, one musician recognizing another. Sloane did not stay to receive congratulations. She asked her assistant to handle the closing remarks. She slipped off her heels and walked in stocking feet down the back corridor that led from the main hall to the loading dock. She found Calvin in the staff hallway, kneeling on one knee, zipping Rosie's jacket. He had already turned down the check the event coordinator tried to hand him. He was simply getting his daughter ready for the drive home. There were no cameras here, no herringbone floors, no crystal sconces, only a concrete corridor with buzzing fluorescent tubes and the faint, distant resonance of a Steinway still sustaining its last notes in the empty hall. Sloane stopped a few feet away. Without the heels, without the gown's intended posture, she looked smaller than she had on the stage. She looked, for the first time that evening, like a person instead of a company. "You were going to leave," she said, without saying goodbye. Calvin finished zipping Rosie's jacket before he answered. "I did what I came to do." "No." Sloane's voice was steady but not hard. "You did something no one in that room could do. You saved my grandfather's company, and you did it after I embarrassed you in front of 300 people." He did not use that against her. He only said evenly, "You're not the first person to see my jacket before they saw my hands." The sentence landed harder than any accusation, because it told her that her behavior had not been special. It had been ordinary. It had been one more small wound in a long line of small wounds given to a man who had borne every one of them without complaint. Then let me be the first one to make it right, Sloane said. She offered him a position, a consulting role with Whitfield and Pace, overseeing the restoration and maintenance of the house's entire instrument collection, with full authority over methods and a salary that would mean he could stop driving from church to church in a truck with a cracked windshield. Calvin did not answer immediately. He looked down at Rosie, who was watching Sloane with the careful measuring eyes of a child who has already decided that this woman will need to earn something before she is trusted. My schedule belongs to my daughter, Calvin said. I don't take work that makes me miss her school concerts or her parent conferences or dinner. Sloane crouched until she was eye level with Rosie. She spoke to the girl directly, not over her head. Then we'll build the schedule around her school day. If your dad works with us, the work fits around you, not the other way around. Rosie studied her for a long moment, the way she had studied a stray cat on the porch last autumn before deciding it was safe to set out a bowl of milk. Then, with the sudden, ungovernable honesty that belongs only to 7-year-olds, she said, "Are you really going to take my daddy to Carnegie Hall?" The corridor went very quiet. Calvin's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. Sloane, the woman who had handled hostile boardrooms and 80-year-old philanthropists without flinching, turned a shade of pink that no amount of executive training could have prevented. Calvin looked at her. His expression was mild, and for the first time that evening, gently amused. "That was your promise," he said. "Not mine." Sloane straightened slowly. She did not look away. "I run an auction house," she said. "We don't break our word. It's in the charter." A small sound came from Calvin. It was not quite a laugh. It was the closest thing to a laugh he had made in a very long time. But he did not fall into the moment the way a man in a movie would. "Coffee?" he said. "No cameras, no investors, no board members, and nobody," he added, glancing once at Rosie's upturned face. Lan nodded. "Agreed." The three of them walked together down the service corridor toward the parking garage. Behind them, deep in the empty auction hall, the Whitfield Concert Grand stood under its single spotlight, with its lid raised and its strings still humming faintly, the way a great instrument hums when it has finally been heard by someone who knew how to ask. To Sloane, it was the sound of her grandfather's legacy returning. To Calvin, it was proof, if his daughter ever needed proof again, that her faith in him had never been misplaced. To Rosie, who walked between them with her music box in one hand and her father's rough hand in the other, it was the sound of the night her daddy made a whole room full of fancy people stand up and listen. Between Calvin and Sloane, it was not yet love. It was something better suited to a first step. It was respect, quietly earned and honestly given, and in time it would become the ground on which everything that followed was built.